everybody. Welcome. My name is Claudia Quintero, and I'm the Senior Director and co-founder of one of the co-founders of Common Ground. Thank you for joining us for today's Learning Community Talk, which is titled Becoming an Ally, Partnering with Immigrant Families to Promote Student Success, a conversation with Dr. Stephany Cuevas. For those of you new to Common Ground Talks, we welcome you. And just wanted to share a little bit about who we are. So Common Ground provides statewide and community-facing organizations with funding, a supportive and well-managed learning community, and access to expertise to bring about the sustainable change that matters most to their community. Through our collaboration networks and action accelerators, Common Ground provides these supports to organizations and their leaders to connect with their peers and participate in leadership development to better meet the needs of their community. And there's some more information about our Action Accelerator model in the chat. For today's talk, Dr. Cuevas and I will discuss the role of schools, districts, and community organizations that they play in supporting immigrant families. Specifically, Dr. Cuevas will share recommendations from her report commissioned by Carnegie Corporation of New York that was published just last month, titled Becoming an Ally, Partnering with Immigrant Families to Promote Student Success. This report focuses on practical ways educators can better engage with immigrant families as partners to support their students' learning and socio-emotional well-being. You can access this report in the chat as well. And we actually just learned today that this report is also going to be translated into Spanish and some other languages soon. So once we have that, we'll also share that resource as well to our learning community. So a little bit about Dr. Stephany Cuevas. She's an assistant professor at the Attallah College of Educational Studies at Chapman University. And for the past 10 years, Dr. Cuevas has worked to support underrepresented students, their families, and the educators who work with them. She is committed to work that actively seeks to expose and combat issues of inequality. Her current research explores how family engagement shifts and changes as first-generation students advance in and complete their post-secondary trajectories. Before we begin today, here are just a few logistics. So after about 30 minutes of conversation between myself and Dr. Cuevas, we'll spend the last 15 minutes of our talk fielding your questions. So just as a reminder, please submit any questions that you have for Dr. Cuevas through the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to get to them throughout the conversation today. Like all of our Common Ground talks, the session from today will be recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube channel this week as well. So after our 45-minute or so conversation, we invite you to stay on for our off-the-record discussion. So at the 45-minute mark, we'll just turn off the recording and we'll continue the conversation till the top of the hour, which is 3 o'clock Eastern time. This is a signature component of our talk series, so we really hope you can join us and stay on, and it's a great chance to meet with other leaders who are in this webinar. So with that, I'm really excited to have you with us today, Dr. Cuevas, and I'm going to pass it over to you to share a little bit more about your work and your research on how educators can better partner with immigrant families in their educational journey of their students. So over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining us. First of all, I want to thank Common Ground. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Claudia. And I'm really excited to engage in conversation today. I really love that we have framed this as a conversation, which gives me a break from lecturing, not gonna lie. It gives me a break from being in professor mode. So what I'm gonna do right now is essentially, Claudia gave a little bit of my bio. And as she mentioned, I am a scholar. I'm a family engagement scholar, and I focus specifically on college access, college readiness for Latinx first-generation students. So that's essentially my quote-unquote research background. But I want to do, I always think it's very important before I start giving you numbers and giving you data and research, which I'm really excited about. I kind of want to give you a little bit of background about myself and who I am and how I came to this work. I really do think that my research and my works at the intersection of family engagement and the sociology of immigration, and those two merge together is essentially how can family engagement as a pedagogy, as a resource, as a tool, help support immigrant students, including English language learners, children of undocumented parents, and the like. So that is a little bit about like the research context where I'm coming from. But before that, I really, like I've mentioned before, I think it's important for you to understand my positionality. I was born in, I'm currently living in Orange County, California, Southern California, where I teach at Chapman University. But I grew up about 20 miles from here in Huntington Park, California, which is part of Los Angeles. So I grew up in a predominantly working poor community. And I've always said that when I was a child, I could get around not speaking English. I only had to speak English in my classrooms because I'm part of the generation where they made bilingual education illegal here in California. So I grew up in a predominantly Mexican, Central American neighborhood in public schools. You know, we can do research. There's research that notes that overcrowded large public schools are not the best for our students. So I am a product of that. But throughout my childhood, my mother was my most fierce advocate. She knew that she wanted her daughters. I'm also the oldest of three. So any of you in the audience that are the oldest child in your family, you know that you are the guinea pig of the family. So I'm the oldest daughter of three, it's three girls. And my mother always told me that I was going to go to college. It wasn't, Stephany, do you want to go to college? It's, Stephany, where are you going to go to college? So she always made sure that she advocated for the best resources that my school had to offer. If there was honors courses, she would put me in them, AP courses, after school programs. So she was always highly involved because she was physically present in my schools. And that completely changed when she couldn't help me get to college. She didn't know how to help me apply for college. She didn't know how to help me get into it. So eventually I joined a TRIO program and they got me to college. And eventually I went to UC Berkeley for graduate school, for undergrad. I'm speeding up. For undergraduate. And then there is where I decided I wanted to be a college counselor and work directly with parents due to the experience that I had with my mom. Growing up in high school, I felt that my educators will leave my mother outside of the college going conversations, and I wanted to switch that and change that. So eventually I became a college advisor for the Oakland Unified School District, where very similar to my own school district, it was big and overpopulated and they just needed help. So I ended up being assigned to one of the largest high schools in the school district. And there where the Spanish speaking parents found out that I spoke Spanish, I'm fluent in Spanish, they all flocked to me. They were like, Stephany, Miss Stephany, we want to help our kids get to college, but we don't know how to. So eventually I started asking them, well, what kind of questions do you have? They're like, oh, we want to know how to help our kids get to college, pay for college. We've heard it's expensive. I'm like, okay, what other questions do you have? What's the difference between a community college and a 4-year and a private? And essentially just started asking them their questions. And we started designing workshops around this time. We decided to have the workshops at 6 a.m. in the morning because that was the time when it was possible. That was the time when all parents, because these parents were working multiple jobs, we can all meet at 6 a.m. And I told them, if you all bring me the cafecito, if you all bring me the coffee and the snacks, I will be there at 6 a.m. So eventually I started developing really good relationships with these parents, right? They will come to me, we will meet every other week and discuss several things, not only about college going, but deconstruction, the American educational system, explaining how busing worked in the school district, right? All in Spanish, because again, I'm fluent in Spanish. And because of this, I developed relationships with them and they began to trust me with questions and tensions that they felt. So it was at this point that families began to disclose that they were undocumented, meaning that they didn't have any form of legal status here in the United States. And they were worried that because they were undocumented, their children were going to be punished and not be allowed to go to college here in the United States. Me being the bright-eyed college advisor that was trained and informed, I knew that this wasn't true. Even if their children were undocumented in California at the time, there was the AB 540 policy that let them attend college and pay in-state tuition. There was specific, it was harder, but there were specific scholarships, right? So I knew this context, and no matter how much I tried to undo and demystify the concept of college for undocumented parents, I still saw the fear in their eyes. So I looked for resources and I couldn't find anything that brought together how do you help undocumented immigrant parents navigate education in the system. Long story short, I had a little world crisis, little mini crisis that happens as you are a senior in college. I realized that I also like research. So there I go applying to grad programs. But that question is what took me to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I got my doctorate and investigated the ways that an immigration status, undocumented status specifically, impacts the relationships that families have with schools. In graduate school, I also had the language of family engagement. And this is where I learned that by asking parents, developing relationships, I was actually engaging in promising practices around family engagement. I didn't know that I was developing and cultivating trust. I didn't know that I was co-creating curriculum with the families, right? But for me, it just made sense. So, hey, families, what do you need? What do you want? Let me ask you so I can create the curriculum, so we can co-create the curriculum in ways that matter for you. So that's a little bit about my background. Again, that is the research that brought me and the tensions that brought me to the research world. And what I'm gonna do now is, before we begin in very exciting conversations with Claudia, again, I am an educator. You cannot take, even though right now it's finals weeks for my students, you cannot take the educator out of the classroom. I'm gonna give you a little bit of context. Some of you may be familiar with these numbers and with some of the data that I'm gonna offer, but again, it's important to understand the context. So when we think about immigrants in the United States, it's currently estimated that about 45 million immigrants, or roughly 14% of our population, are immigrants. And then one thing that I want to note here when I use the word immigrant is anyone that migrated to the United States, whether through authorization or undocumented or temporary protection status, right? There's different ways that we can categorize immigrants. But that is more of the larger bucket. And it's also estimated that by 2065, about 36% of the US population will be immigrants and their children. So again, thinking about the context, thinking about the population that we work with, it's important to have these numbers. Now, when we think about the importance, and like I mentioned, my expertise is on undocumented immigrants, is estimated about, we hear that 11 million number, that there are about 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the US, and about 4.5 million children in the US have at least one undocumented parent. So that's about 8% of our children. I often, when I work with educators, I tell them that they're just as likely to work with a child from a mixed status family, meaning that one parent's undocumented, as they are to work with the child from a divorced household. Right. So when we think about statistically, what are we likely to have as part of our learning communities, we're likely to have a child whose parent is undocumented. And this last statistic is also important to consider, because 85% of English language learners are in grades PK through 5, and 62% of those in the grades 6 through 12 are US born. Again, something that I want to push us is to really challenge the perceptions of immigrants equals English language learners, which that isn't always essentially the correct assumption. And then another thing that I want to quickly define, again, family engagement is a term that I keep throwing in there, but family engagement is often defined in different ways. And this is a definition that I personally like. It's from the National Family School and Community Engagement Working Group, where they say that family engagement is a shared responsibility in which schools and other community agencies and organizations are committed to reaching out to engage families in meaningful ways, and in which families are committed to actively supporting their children's learning and development. And the reason why I like and enjoy this particular definition is because it shows the different stakeholders involved in making sure that our children are developing, healthy, not only academically, but also socio-emotionally. So we have our schools, our community organizations and agencies, and our families, which I call the perfect trifecta, working together for the well-being of our children. And then really now narrowing it down, putting these two together, research has really found that family engagement is a great tool to help our immigrant and multilingual families. So effective family engagement practices, meaning when schools, community organizations, and families are working together, families feel more better empowered to support their children's well-being. It also helps families feel welcome in new environments and spaces. And it also centers the strengths and needs of families, right? So if we get to know our families, we get to understand not only their needs, what they require, but also their strengths and their assets and what they bring. So very quickly, I've thrown a lot of information at you right now, but all of this can really be dispelled and further understood in the Carnegie report. So if you want more details and information about that, highly encourage you to read the report, not only because I wrote it, but I do think that I go over the theories and the foundations of family engagement, but I also highlight several organizations, including See Common Ground, that are doing this work effectively and respectfully and honoring our immigrant families. So that's a little bit about my context setting spiel. So now I am looking forward to diving deeper and engaging in conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Cuevas, for that context setting, like you said, and just wanted to echo that there's so much good information in the report as well, and highly recommend taking time to read it. But like you said, let's just dive right into the conversation. And I just wanted to start with some of the numbers that you posted on that first slide around English learners and the amount or the maybe perceived correlation between English learners and immigrant student populations. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, what are some of those assumptions that exist, like that one, if there are others that you've really come across often. And, what are the dangers of assumptions, of course, but then also what are some ways that we can combat some of those misperceptions about English learners and immigrant students and, really see it more of, a population that really is also American born and has this incredible asset of being on a path towards bilingualism. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit.
You throw me all the questions, but I think it's something, so it is, and again, part of our larger narrative around immigrants and immigrant students in schools, particularly in schools that I've seen and studied and personally experienced, is that when schools, whoever is doing enrollment, or there are assumptions based, right? Like we are products of our society. And when educators learn that children are immigrants themselves, meaning the child themselves migrated to the US, or that their parents immigrated to the US and only speak a particular language at home, that the child is automatically placed as an English language learner, right? Without actually taking the time to get to know the child and their families and their particular context. So that's where there is this major assumption where immigrant equals English language learner, which is often, it can be the case, right? But there's also the dangers of that not being the case. I've been in several contexts where yes, the child may have migrated to the United States, but they were enrolled in quote unquote American schools in their countries of origin, where they have taken instruction in English, right? Or actually the English may be a dominant language that they face, right? So again, without engaging in conversation with the family and the child, we wouldn't be able to know that, right? There are ethical ways that you can quote unquote test for the English fluency for children, right? But again, the first step, it's really about engaging in conversation and communicating with families about like what is actually your background and your context and where you're coming from. Because to answer part of your question, one of the dangers is, right, like this misassigning, misdiagnosing a student, right? It's putting them academically at a level that is not challenging them, right? That they could be growing developmentally. And then the flip side of that is like, well, if we don't actually ethically test our students, like we may be denying them resources that they have access to help them improve their English fluency. And I think a sub question and almost a sub theme that is present here then is and this is a bigger societal question that I'm often considering, right? Like, we as a society go back and forth between valuing bilingualism or knowing more than one language, right? So as we are English language learners, there's often the assumption, again, unintentionally or sometimes intentionally, of if an individual, whether it's a family member, a parent, or a student doesn't speak English, there's assumption that, oh, quote unquote, they're dumb, right? Or they won't be able to navigate the system, where actually they may be brilliant in their first language, but we don't understand that, right? So I think one thing that as a society we also need to elevate is like, okay, as much as we're supporting our English language learners, students learn English, we also should be embracing and centering their first language, right? And honoring that bilingualism and that ability to translate between languages, and that, because that makes it richer and makes them like a more quote unquote well-rounded individual in our global economy. So I think that that's also one of the dangers that I often, as a English language learner myself, I often think about, like, right, what if they had extracted my Spanish speaking abilities and put me in I mean, they did put me in English language. They did put me in English only, but my parents made sure to speak Spanish to me at home because that's what they knew, right? Neither of my parents feel comfortable speaking English, so they maintained my Spanish. But I think it's an interesting question of like, what are we valuing and how are we seeing English language learners as individuals full of richness and wealth.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just on the bilingualism piece just relates so much to what you just said. I also learned Spanish at home and learned English at school. And, you know, I just appreciate that so much. And my parents teaching me Spanish at home, because, you know, it's like, I always say I can laugh in two languages, I can love in two languages, you know, it's actually a richness and an excess of kind of experiences and information. So wonderful. Thank you. And, you know, another big part of your work and what you do across, you know, college, K-12, all the work that you've done, you know, is focusing on that building of trust and the relationships. And I appreciated you sharing your journey too, of how you were maybe kind of inherently doing some things that later you know, just there was a name for it, but that there are some things that we kind of innately understand that are important in building relationships and trust with others. And there was something that I really liked in the report that the way that you framed, you know, making sure that educators and school leaders make time to get to know families. And it's not really you know, how do we take time to do it, but rather that we make time to do it. So do you have any examples of how educators and other school leaders can kind of incorporate those opportunities to engage with immigrant families, whether it's maybe in the school building or outside? And what are some kind of examples or approaches for making that time to really get to know families and the students and their home context?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is often difficult when I try to like convince people about the importance of family engagement and partnership. It's a time element, right? Because in education and related fields, time is like the one of two things that we're often lacking or missing or wanting more of. The other is money. But so time and money are like our essential components, right? But there are strategic ways that schools and organizations can take what they already have and invite families in, right? So, and it's just figuring out ways that I'm using the global we, right? Like educators and families can get to know each other at the human level. Research on family engagement, but also on relationship development and on community organizing shows that when the different people involved in a child's life know each other first as individuals and humans. So I'm gonna know you, Claudia, as you're my child's teacher, but I want to know you as an individual before, okay, now that I know that you're a cat person and that you're allergic to dogs, I don't know if this is true, but this is my scenario. I cannot talk to you about, or that we may like the same music, we have similar taste in food, right? Like now I like you and as a person, and now when you tell me that my child is not turning in the homework, I'm not gonna come in defensively and be like, okay, Claudia, Miss Claudia, she's cool, right? Like there might be a reason why she's giving my child X grade, right? So again, it's about developing that relationship, and going back to your question of what are ways that can be done is just like you either, I think the role of school or organization leadership is very important. I think that they set the tone and the model. So I've seen, for example, principals at the elementary and middle school level, or coffee with the principal every Friday, right? So every Friday, 8 a.m., they're gonna have donuts and coffees, and parents, family members can drop in, engage in conversation with the principal. And I've been in conversation with principals that are like, sometimes I only have like 2 parents. Sometimes I have 15. The first one's usually like 35, right? And he's like, I understand that like life happens and not everybody can make it. But for those 2 parents that come, I know them, right? And when I need support for programming for X, Y, and Z from the parent angle, I know that I can count on them, right? And they have friends, right? So those 2 parents, each of them have their little buckets of parents, and then they just build from that, right? So again, it's about being very intentional. And in teachers, very similarly, right? I've had teachers, I've worked with teachers who say like, the best part of getting to know parents is a drop off and pickup, right? I'm out there and like just finding ways that I can go into get to know parents. Now I have also, again, I have stories from across the nation, and independent of the context. I've had teachers that tell me, I go to the laundromat where I know that the families do laundry, right? So I need to do laundry, they're doing laundry, let me go there and be like, oh, look, I'm not just your big scary teacher. I too need to do laundry and I hate it. Let's get to know each other at the human level, right? So there's different ways that it's just about how do you get to know individuals at the personalized level. And then, okay, let's get down to work. What do we need to do to improve our child's education? So it's really about finding ways and getting creative with making those connections. And again, sometimes they're in infrastructure, so like the parent teacher association, right? Like the parent advisory board. And other times are more informal conversationals, like, oh, let's do laundry together. I also had one of my teachers go get their hair, like they needed their braids done. So they're like, I know that one of my students' parents does braids. I'm gonna go there. She realized that parent knew a lot of parents. So again, it's about building those connections.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those examples and the very clear pictures of meeting families where they're at too, and not always having to be within the school building, but that it can also be kind of outside those school walls. And just a quick plug for folks, just feel free to add questions into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll definitely get to them. But I have another question building off of what you were just saying about kind of those connections and those ripple effects. And we've just seen that there's many different people that are working within a school building, right? There's maybe the person who's at the front office that maybe welcomes a family into the first day, but there's also coaches and maybe art teachers that don't have to lean so much on English if they're still learning English, that maybe connect, like you said, with students or families at a more individual or human level before getting into kind of the academics and the other pieces. So what other, advice do you have for folks in terms of building out those networks, those connections of, maybe having a team of adults within a school that are helping to support a student beyond just the kind of main teacher that many students have?
Yeah, and that's a great question, particularly when we think about specifically about immigrant families, right? So I think that and other populations, but another thing that is also seen in the research, right, is that families, regardless of where they're at in context, sometimes may have negative experiences with schools, maybe they feel like because they don't speak English well, they don't feel comfortable attending. Maybe the first time that they visited the school, the front desk person was having a bad day and they were rude to them. They don't feel welcomed, right? They themselves may have very traumatic, negative experiences with schools and teachers. There are different reasons why families, parents, grandparents may not feel comfortable developing a relationship with teachers. And I think that, and we talked about this before, right? Like it's this idea of ghosts, right? So like everyone involved, Professor Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot has this concept of ghosts in the classrooms. So she takes the example of a parent-teacher conference where the parent and the teacher both come into the space with assumptions, with ideas of what the other's role should be, and with their own experiences. And she calls these ghosts, like, right, there's these things like, yes, we're here to discuss the students' academic progress, but actually there's a lot more in that classroom that we don't know about, right? So as much as they could be negative ghosts, so like experiences of trauma. So if I, as a student, I saw my teachers treat my mom bad, I'm gonna like not like teachers, right? Or like on the other side, right? If I, as a student, my parents had a great relationship with my teachers, I'm gonna have more positive ghosts. Like you have, this is your Caspers, the friendly ghosts, right? But again, these invisible forces are present. And the reason why your question reminded me of this is that we as educators need to understand that, right? And be aware that maybe we are not the person that families trust the most. Maybe it's the after school coach, right, of sports. Maybe it's the arts teacher, right? Maybe it's the other teacher who shares an identity with them that they feel more comfortable. And that's why, again, this is why family engagement, it's really a teamwork, right? So it's, okay, if I know that I'm not connecting directly with the parent right now, but they have a good relationship with the art teacher, I'm gonna go connect with that art teacher and be like, hey, what help me help this parent, right? Or like maybe it's expanding out, like it's understanding what are the organizations, community organizations, after school programs that are in our local area that may have students, and developing relationships with them. So partnering, right? So it's partnering with the local YMCA, partnering with the local after school programs, with the arts programs, with the summer camps, right? So again, it's almost like, again, it's really about connections and networking, essentially, that helps build that. And again, the more families see you trying to connect with them in different spaces, the more like, okay, Stephany, I see you're trying. I guess I can give you a shot, right? But it's really about expanding and making those connections. And again, that takes time. That takes time after a 10-hour day. Who wants to go do another hour at the after school program? But something that has been, like, research shows, and that I've seen and experienced as well, is that family engagement, teachers and after school service providers often say that family engagement is the best tool of classroom management that they can come. Right? So they're like, it's hard work, not gonna lie, it takes a lot of investment. But once that relationship is built, like once teacher and educator, teacher and after school program provider have that relationship, the students know. So if my student is misbehaving in a classroom, be like, I'm gonna text your mom, student knows that, oh, Miss Stephany is actually really cool with my mom or my grandma or my auntie, whoever it is, I'm gonna behave, right? So it's been really cool to see how teachers that I've worked with come back to me and be like, Dr. Cuevas, I thought you were crazy when you were telling me that I should do home visits and develop relationships and give 1 extra hour of my day to my job, but it's so worth it, because now I have not only our parents and I on the same page in terms of goals for our children, but also like my classroom is wonderful, right? So I think I'm always like, I'm a little competitive. So I'm like, I told you so, right? So I do that, right? But I think that it shows, and again, it's people being in relationship with people as human beings.
Thank you so much for those examples. And it's a good reminder too that, the students are also keenly aware that team of adults, right? And so even if it's not necessarily being said directly, they're aware that when multiple people are invested in their success and the teamwork that's happening. So thank you so much for that. And I think the other big piece I know we wanted to discuss, it's also in the report, but I know something that you're really passionate about, as well as the idea of professional development and what kind of, supports that educators and principals, in addition to each other and the community within and outside of the school, but what kind of information or knowledge or practice might be helpful for educators in terms of being more engaged with families of their students, and especially immigrant families, and maybe what are some of the unique things that they should be looking out for in some of that professional development.
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating elements, I think, right now of my work as a researcher, that works a lot with schools, school districts, after school programs, different entities, is the training and development part, right? So like now schools are being like, we want family engagement. Teachers are required to do family engagement. Now there's a couple of school districts that part of principal report cards use is family engagement. So everybody's like, okay, finally, we are convincing folks that family engagement is important. What counts as family engagement is a separate question, and we can dive into that. But very few individuals are actually trained on how to work with families, right? So if any teachers in the audience, think back to your credentialing program. How many of you had a class on family engagement, family community, school partnerships, right? How many maybe were required to do a webinar, a series, right? Anything that like showed you how to work with families is very rare in our educational field, and not only in schools, but in outside fields. Right now, I'm doing a study on college access professionals, so people that are coming into schools and helping students with the college application program. They're also not trained, right? They're told work with the families. They're told not, their counselors very similarly, right? Like they're told like, hey, work with families, and they're like, oh no, I'm scared of calling, right? I experienced that, right? I was like, I don't want to make those phone calls. I need to call these parents, and I would like be so happy when they didn't answer, right? Because we're not trained. And I think that again, it really goes back to leadership, right? So like if I as a principal value family engagement, I'm gonna make sure that some of my professional development sessions are around best practices, right? Because there are wonderful organizations out there doing this work and are willing to provide trainings or resources online. There's several resources. For example, I know that through edX, through Harvard edX, EDX, there's a free course on family engagement, right? That shows you the research and also gives example of best practices. It's free, right? You have to pay if you want to get the little certificate, but if you don't want the little certificate, it's free, right? So there's the national, like I mentioned, the national family engagement organizations throughout, right? So there are people doing this work, but again, leadership needs to value family engagement and invest in it, and make sure that our educators in schools and outside of schools are doing this work. And in that, like I've mentioned, like what counts as family engagement, right? Because sometimes it's like, okay, we had a family math night, check, right? Where we're gonna have one night and like families don't come. We're like, well, we built it, they didn't come, it's not our fault, right? But family engagement is more than that. Again, like I mentioned, it's really about the relationship building and embedding that in different programming. Sometimes they're like, oh, we had parents in the PTA. Great, check. We had family input in our policy. What parents are more likely to be part of the PTA? Research shows that it's not our immigrant, non-English speaking parents. So what are we actively doing to diversify our PTA? Right. So again, little things like that. Again, and knowing how to do that can be done through professional development. Right. So again, then throughout the nation, there's different conversations about micro credentials. So some programs are looking at like, okay, if you do 10 hours of professional development or family engagement, we can give you a micro credential that you're now an expert, right? or if you work closely with your school district's family family and community engagement offices, you will be micro-credentialed, right? So now that we're getting creative in ways that we can embed that professional development, but really it does come down from the leadership. And then sometimes you have individual teachers who are like, okay, mostly, friends that know me, and we're like, what are you doing to do your family engagement? I'm like, my school isn't doing anything. I'm like, okay, that sucks. We'll work on that, but what are you doing? And this is where I send them, like, here's a book. Here is a report. Come read it and come talk to me, right? We can start a book club. And right, so there's different buckets of ways that you can like develop the capacity, because, and again, this is also in the report itself, but we don't develop families' capacities to work with teachers, and we don't develop the capacity of teachers to work with families, right? So here I'm using teachers as our educators, but the same can be said about service providers outside of school settings.
Thank you so much. And before we get to our kind of closing question, just to build on that a little bit too, is, these were all great examples. And, we can talk about this in the overtime too, about the micro-credentialing and some of the other kind of formal, displays of having more capacity in the space. But what role do you see community organizations playing? I know you talked about partnership already, but what are some ways in which community organizations that maybe have other skill sets can play in supporting this student success as well?
Yeah, and one of the things that is community organizations, that's where, and again, particularly when we think about immigrant families, that is often the spaces where they go to, right? So if they need resources, they need services, sometimes they do go to schools, and again, depending on how welcoming schools are, but they go to community organizations, and very similarly, right? Like, it is also community organizations' responsibility to also develop those relationships, right? And not be and move out of like the savior complex. So it's not like, oh, we are a community organization, we have information, resources, let us help you. Instead of the opposite way, like, what do you need? Great, let's work on this, right? Like, oh, I see that you're a great leader, help us, right? Like, oh, like empower families to also develop that leadership capacity. So community organizations, again, there are often the spaces that are most trusted by our community, particularly immigrant families. So they also have a responsibility, right, to make sure that they're authentically partnering and seeing the families and and their children as human and individuals. One thing that I also going back to your questions about assumptions earlier, it's like, there's often like this narrative of like, oh, immigrants, pobrecitos, poor things, it's so hard. It's like, no, yes, they're immigrants, and like the immigration system in our country is broken and it sucks, but also they're complete human beings with stories and richness and assets and a wonderful dramas and again, and really complexifying that. So I think that that's something that I've also been learning through my research and in working with undocumented parents, was like, yes, I'm an undocumented parent and the policies in this country make my life harder, but I also have dreams and aspirations for my children, right? I also mess up. I also don't know how to parent. I also am very overly proud of my child, right? So again, complexifying, and again, it's really about the humanization of each other.
Absolutely. I think that's such a powerful note to end on, and just the richness and humanity of immigrant and families, that it's not an othering, it's just a different life experience, and that they're fully human and part of all of our communities. So I just wanted to thank you so much for this conversation. And before we go into our overtime, which we invite all of you all to stay on for, I just wanted to close with our final question of who is a real life contemporary hero for you that you'd like to share with the group?
This question really stressed me out because I am a millennial, so I was gonna say Beyonce because Beyonce is Beyonce, but then I was like, Stephany, be real. And again, I really I really wanted to be intentional, and I mean, definitely my parents and my two sisters are my heroes. I I'm always in awe that my parents were able to migrate to a country where they didn't know the language and successfully raise my sisters and I. We're all working professionals now. So I think that definitely I am who I am because of them. So, and then my sisters are also very amazing in themselves. But I was also trying to be like contemporary, like here and again, I was like, who uses their platform to do good? And this one's gonna be an LOL stretch, but I think the artist Lizzo. I am a big fan of hers, and not only because her music's good, but the way that she uses her platform to uplift voices and invite people onto her stage, and really uses her role as like a popular figure and is known to advocate for Black Lives Matter, for trans rights, right? So I think that that is a very smart use of her platform and knowing her positionality and use that to support communities. So I think in addition to my family, I think Lizzo, because she's very intentional from what I know and see in the way that she uses her platform. So that is my answer.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing those heroes and for joining us today and for sharing all the work that you do to support immigrant families and students and their success. And just before we go into overtime, just wanted to share that our next talk is going to be on June 21st, where we'll be celebrating Pride Month by hosting a panel with LGBTQ+ student changemakers on current education justice efforts. So we'll share more information and registration details soon, but we invite you to join us for the next talk, and we'll share this recording as well on our YouTube channel where you can see all of our past recordings. So with that, I just wanted to thank you all again, and I'm going to stop the recording here soon and invite you all to stay on for the overtime. So thank you again, Dr. Cuevas.
Of course.